Safe hands here, and I'm glad to say for this occasion I'm joined by the brilliant commentator Benedict Spence. Benedict, great to have you in the studio. Now, you're someone who's been following Middle Eastern geopolitics for an awfully long time. Some might say that this has always slightly been on the cards for decades now, ever since the collapse of the JCPOA, the reinstallation of that, which is, of course, the nuclear deal, realisation that Iran was not obeying the rules, was continuing to proliferate uranium to an extent which might enable them to create a nuclear weapon. Now the focus is on stockpiles of ballistic missiles, an increasingly belligerent regime that we've now seen partially dismantled. The big question, I suppose, now is this going to drag on? Is this going to be contained quickly?
Well, I mean, genuinely, I think, that there are the problem with this situation, unlike, for example, the Russia-Ukraine war, where there were sort of perhaps three different scenarios that you could envisage it going in, is that there are many permutations for this. It's a very complex situation, far more complex than Russia or Ukraine, far more complex in many ways actually than a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be. This has always been the most difficult, and it's partly why so many countries have been so hesitant to get involved. So many countries that, even though they believed fundamentally there would have to be some sort of conflict at some point, have resisted that at all opportunities. And we're seeing that play out now, why that is. The United States and Israel have struck Iran. We all realise that. There was a lot of talk on Friday. I was involved in some of these conversations where a lot of people were saying, oh, Trump's looking for an off-ramp. This is all about intimidation. That's all that it is. Far too much of this has been about emphasis on the United States. And frankly, I don't know why people keep making this mistake. Not enough focus was placed on Israel. And that was always, this has always been the issue. Iran wants nuclear weapons because it believes that eradicating Israel is central not just to its geopolitical strategy, but to its moral strategy, its ideological strategy. Israel must be destroyed. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons yet. Israel does. Israel has said that it will use anything in its means to stop Iran getting nuclear weapons. Iran has said it's going to keep on doing that anyway. The United States is beholden to Israel if Israel decides to go into Iran to support its ally. So, as you say, for as long as the Iranians were continuing to enrich this stuff and continuing towards nuclear weapons, this was always likely to come to a head. And far too many people, I think, have been sitting on their hands thinking, oh, it's one of those situations that'll never actually happen. A bit like people thought about Ukraine and Russia. A bit like people think about China and Taiwan. They just assume that the status quo will remain so in perpetuity. But everybody on all sides have been saying, if this happens, this will happen, and we will then respond. The next thing about all that is, if the Iranians get to this point and they get the bomb, they nearly get the bomb, and so the Israelis attack them, and therefore the US has to get involved, how does Iran respond? It's not just going to be against military installations, US and Israeli military installations. It was then always going to be about oil. And I know lots of people say, oh, all of this is all about oil. Up to a point, obviously, oil plays a crucial role in this, but you don't invade Iran to make the world's oil supply more secure, because by its very nature it jeopardizes it. And we're seeing that now. This is the next phase. Iran is going to divert as many resources to attacking US and Israeli assets to attacking Gulf oil infrastructure. First they said they were going to close the Straits of Hormuz, which they didn't actually do. It was done for them, effectively. What happens is, of course, when a war like that breaks out, the people that insure all the oil tankers go, oh, it's going to cost you an awful lot more to actually run these oil tankers. We're not going to insure these things. So the tankers just stop of their own volition because it's too expensive to run. Then you start hitting the infrastructure. You start hitting the oil fields. You start hitting the refineries. And we have already started to see that. That is, therefore, what prompts the next stage. And this is your question. Is this going to happen quickly or is it going to be elongated? The reason why the Iranians are doing this is, well, we've already seen markets are responding to this. Oil prices are going up, gas prices are going up. That is going to have a huge inflationary effect on lots of places around the world, and it's how long people can actually stomach that. Now, for the record, those prices haven't gone up anywhere near as much as they might have done or have done in the past. But that's not to say that they're not going to continue to rise. Possibly they haven't gone up that much because a lot of people are going, well, hang on, let's just wait. Let's not get ahead of ourselves because it could all be over in a couple of days. But that's the key issue here. How much pain can the rest of the world, the West in particular, Europe really in particular, stomach, say, a 15, 20, 25% price spike in energy and the knock-on effects.
Something I actually feel that America had indeed already priced in. They were due to have a meeting with OPEC and other oil-generating states. And one looks at that perhaps as a precursor for this invasion. America, of course, going via drill, baby, drill, far more able to weather a storm than we are. But we've been told for a long time that we now live in a multipolar world, that we have the axis of Iran, Russia and China and North Korea as and when on one side of things, and on the other side you have the Western world, and then somewhere in the middle there were the Gulf states, which after the Abraham Accords we started to see a softening, a thawing of relations between Israel and her neighbours. I think what stands out for me now is there is a tipping point in which this would have become World War III, were China and Russia to back Iran in more than just rhetoric. And that doesn't seem to be happening. Iran's knocking on the door of the Kremlin going, we have been supplying you with drones this whole time. We've been aiding and abetting your foreign affairs and your sort of interventionist policies. Where is the return on this? And Russia doesn't seem to be assisting. China doesn't seem to be assisting, knowing perhaps what would be at stake if they did. So the next question, I suppose, is if Iran is by itself, it's been belligerent to the regional neighbours who they regard as partnering with the West, with various air bases in use by the Italians, the French, the US, the UK. Well, Iran is very isolated, and so one has to ask if this is an air war of attrition, how long that can play out for.
Yeah. First thing, it's not a world war until Germany invades a neighbour. That's very important to remember. The thing is with this, with this multipolar idea, and I do understand where it comes from, because China is increasingly a peer competitor to the United States. But the issue is none of the other so-called poles are actually anything like a first-rate power. You couldn't compare any of them to the United States or China or even to the Soviet Union. Russia is a very distant third, very distant third. India is not really worth talking about, if I'm honest. Iran isn't either. Lots of these other so-called... Europe, I'm afraid, is also not really worth talking about because it's not united. It's not a central pole. It has many within, many different poles within
and massively dwindled defence capabilities.
And so we have to think of it in those terms, A. B, in terms of the alliance of this sort of anti-Western bloc. First and foremost, there is no ideological alignment with any of them other than that they suspect the United States of trying to undermine them. These suspicions are, of course, very true, because that is what the United States wants to do, which is to remain the top dog and to assert itself. China is not interested in spreading communism around the world like the Soviet Union is. This is something that lots of people, including here, get wrong. It is not the Soviet Union. It's interested in preserving itself and being rich. It is learning from the century of humiliation, where it became one of the world's poorest countries, and it is rapidly industrialized, and what it wants is to remain rich. For that, it needs access to raw materials. Iran has lots of those. That's the only real reason why they're friends, because the Chinese are also very good friends with the Saudis for the same reason, and the Saudis and the Iranians are not exactly
I suppose as well, the Chinese no doubt desire to have Iranian oil and other utilities in that regard.
But they will get it from anywhere that they can get it. And, they're not particularly friends with the Russians either. It's just, again, Russia needs to sell its raw materials. It has lots of them, and China was a willing buyer.
But do you regard Iran's immediate reaction, which is this sort of flinging around ballistics to a really sort of wide circumference against neighbours, and some neighbours whose involvement in this has really been, a tangent, really, a proxy by a tangent,
lots of these neighbours have not, in fact, been involved at all.
Exactly. So was the ambition to sort of concretise hostility against the US by saying, well, look, when they're belligerent, we're all affected? Because to me, it would seem to have the reverse consequence.
No, it's not that. It is just that the regime feels that this is an existential crisis. As I said at the start, in lieu of actually getting nuclear weapons, the plan was always to batter the region's oil and gas infrastructure. That means, by definition, attacking all of those Arab neighbours who account for, 20 to 30% of the world's oil and gas. That was always what it was, regardless of what they were doing. There have been no Kuwaiti jets or Qatari jets or anything like that actively attacking Iran. It's hit them anyway. That's the thing. Because it doesn't actually view them as peer competitors. It doesn't really view them as threats. It simply sees them as you say, sort of increasingly vassals of the United States and Israel, and therefore fair game. The Gulf states, the GCC, play all sides because they are in the business of selling their raw materials, and they'll sell it to anybody. If that includes the United States, then the Iranians will go, okay, you're doing business with them, fine, bam, 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 we're okay with that. Because, we don't do business with the United States in the same way. And we don't think, frankly, that you have the resources to retaliate. And if we're honest, they don't. All of those states rely on Western states to defend them, which is why we're talking about the possibility of RAF involvement in this conflict, because the RAF has a responsibility to ostensibly our allies, not really our allies, but our partners in the region, as does the United States, as does Israel.
So what do you make, actually, of the UK's position in all of this? Because I've had friends in Israel sitting in bomb shelters saying, my God, your Prime Minister is dreadful. I mean, what is he doing? Well, that's not news,
is it?
That's not news. But it seems to me that the rationale of Sir Keir Starmer has been, we're going to make it plainly clear that we were not involved in the offensive by not enabling America to launch its heavy aircraft, its bombers and so forth from Fairford, RAF Fairford, which is a US airbase. And he seems to have gone to great pains to make it clear that we were not involved in starting this, but now these bases can be used in order to defend against the consequences of this. But in both circumstances, he's talking as if, well, the US now have to take out the missile sites in Iran. But that is what the offensive was all about. It was a sort of preeminent strike on taking out those missile bases. The EU have actually, in some respects, I mean, normally Sir Keir Starmer's in lockstep with Canada and Australia over these things, who have actually been supportive of the US affirmative action. And even the EU have been, I would argue, a little bit more affirmative when it comes to backing America-ish than the UK.
Although they are only having their meeting today.
Well,
sort of
two or three
days later.
A few sort of,
you can't expect bureaucrats to get to the office. They all have to get their trains from all over Europe.
And that meeting's just going to be, what, a meeting?
Agreeing to have another meeting later. But they do all agree on the importance of a meeting. Listen, the UK's position actually in this is very complicated. And there are going to be people who are probably going to disagree with me on this. I don't think it's unfair what Keir Starmer is doing. Lots of people are saying he's being weak, this, that and the other. Yeah, he is. But what are people expecting the UK to do in this situation? Has anybody actually taken a good look at the state of our armed forces or the state of MOD spending? Has anybody actually had a look at what kind of kit we have out there? What is the point of us getting involved in a conflict like that? I do agree that we should be allowing the United States and our allies to use bases that we have an agreement already in place with them for them to be able to use. The argument about international law, we've been through this so many times, no one cares. It's not real. Look at what's happening right now.
No one, the baddies don't listen to international law.
What are we going to do? We're going to send around the international police? Oh, that's the United States, and they're the ones doing the bombing. It's silly. It's self-indulgent, and it's the sort of thing that the Labour Party uses to justify things for itself.
This is where I think Sir Keir Starmer's decision has been a political one, not about international law.
A lot of this
the international law is now being used as a smokescreen for a political decision.
A lot of this is domestic. Right now, Keir Starmer, especially on the back of this by-election result in Gordon and Denton, where things like Gaza come up on the doorstep. Now, there are a lot of gibbering half-wits in this country who believe that Iran are not the bad guys. They equate Iran with Gaza, with Hezbollah, as some sort of axis of resistance against the evil Jews. That's what they think, and a lot of these people, the Labour Party, would quite like to vote for them. So, Keir Starmer wants it to be really clear to these people, we had nothing to do with the invasion of nice, friendly, sweetness and light Iran.
Is it just about those voting blocks, which evidently, looking at what happened in Gorton, they lost anyway? Or is it also about, because of course this is coinciding with suggestions from the Secretary of Defence that the terror threat level is going to be put up. Is this, we didn't prescribe the IRGC when the rest of Europe did.
There's another element to this. It is also, I think, about trying to dampen down, not just the IRGC, because there are other organisations and there are lone wolf attacks and cells all across Europe. That will happen regardless, let's be clear, because people like that, again, they are of the gibbering half-wit tendency and they like to lash out at anything Western, which is bizarre because they've moved to the West because it's not a backwards country that they've run away from. But, they want to turn it into that kind of backwards thing, fine. They'll do that anyway, but there is obviously an attempt to try to simmer down expectations, but go back also to what I said at the very start of all of this, which is oil and the possibility of price spikes and therefore spiralling inflation.
Yeah.
Keir Starmer does not want to be blamed for that. It's probably going to happen if this war lasts any more than a couple of weeks.
We're in trouble deep.
Yeah, we are in a huge amount of trouble because Europe has taken the magnificent decision that energy is just, it's abundant and it's in the wind and it's in the air and you don't need to drill for it. So Europe is going to be absolutely caned very hard by this.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to be blamed by people for being seen as being pro the event that led to it.
Right.
He wants to be able to sit back and go, listen, this is dreadful, but I did what I could. I tried to protect British interests. I can't stop a rogue American president
at the very least,
or Israel.
At the very least, it has demonstrated publicly and humiliatingly how much on the back foot that we are, largely as a result of a consistent, terrible succession of government, terrible policy makers over energy and geopolitics. We'll come back to all of those topics, including what this means domestically, a bit later on in the programme. But we're going to take a short break now.